We've got a lot to talk about today. This is part of a series where we'll be talking about data cleanup and how we can sort of where we're going in terms of library data, how we can clean up data, how we can migrate data, all of those sorts of topics. So this particular session, we're going to be talking a lot more about MARCEDIT, and I am going to just kind of go through these slides very, very quickly about the Adobe software. So if you've used Adobe, I think most of you have. I recognize a lot of familiar names in there. If you have used the Adobe software, you'll notice you have some choices in terms of what you can do. The big reminder is just when we get to the end of the session today, please make sure to go ahead and close out and exit instead of leaving your window open, because that way I will know that you're not waiting to ask me a question or anything like that. I will stay around for a few minutes after today's session. You can also email me, and I'll give you my email information in just a few minutes. You will tell me, I know we do this every time, so you have done this many, many times, but if you will tell me, your name's going to automatically appear, but some of you, I see initials and things like that. So if you'll just tell me a little bit about yourself, really whatever you want to tell me today. You could tell me where you work or what your position is. You could tell me a little bit about what you've done with other metadata formats, MARC, Dublin Core, XML. If you used any of those sorts of tools, MARCEDIT, if you've used that before, you can let me know that. Just tell me whatever you would like to tell me about yourself, or if there's something in particular that you would like to know about MARCEDIT or about data editing, cleanup, and things like that, you can pop that in the chat box as well. So if you'll just go ahead and over on the right side of your menu, you should see a little chat box. If you'll just tell me a little bit about yourself and tell me a little bit about what you are working on. So just to give you a little bit of background as you're typing, many of you have already heard my background a few times now, but I've worked in a lot of different libraries, primarily higher education. I have worked with the public libraries. I do training with public libraries, done some consulting work and projects with the public libraries. I've worked on some very early, so I've been in part of the project planning stage of institutional repositories. I've also been on the development, building institutional repository side of it. Typically, I've been tapped for my metadata experience and my cataloging background, as well as sort of my web experience. So I get tapped for those kinds of projects quite a bit. Currently, I am now working on a project. We are just migrating to Alma, and or have just migrated to Alma. Alma is an Ex Libris product, so we were a Voyager library. So I've been on, let's see, I've worked with Circe, I worked with Evergreen some, I worked on an open library project. It wasn't called Open Library, that's a different thing, but I worked on an open library project that really didn't go anywhere, but you know, worked on sort of an open source library project. Worked with Circe, Voyager, few homegrown systems, some MySQL databases, all of that kind of thing. Alma now, in terms of institutional repositories, DSpace, Fedora, Isladora, Ameca, and seems like I'm missing something. Content management systems, Drupal, and WordPress, so a little bit of everything. So a little bit of everything. I see some of you are also in my little bit of everything category. We will talk today about MARCEDIT, and we're going to talk, there was just a version that rolled out sort of recently, and there's some information upcoming about newer versions, just some new news as of the last couple of days about what's going to be happening with MARCEDIT. So Terry does a lot of good work on MARCEDIT. So we'll talk all about MARCEDIT today. Regular expressions. Oh, there's a good one. We may explore that one towards the end of the series. That would be a good topic to put in. Thank you. That's a good idea. So there's a lot to learn about, you know, sort of how you think about data and what you can do with it once you get it out of, you know, the MARCEDIT record. In terms of doing things like using MARC records to generate reports, and how you can get, sometimes depending on your ILS, you may be a little bit limited in terms of what kind of reports you can write. And sometimes if you can get a MARC record or a group of MARC records out of out of your ILS, then you can do much more with them than you could within the ILS. Of course, if you have a lot of records, defining it down to a manageable amount can be a little bit tricky. So you really can even pull MARC records into an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, you can do it, but if you have hundreds of thousands of records, you're going to find that it's going to probably not work. But if you can define it down to a small group of records, like 200 records, or even 50 records or something like that, your chances of being able to pull that information out and actually do some searching and manipulation of the data is much more likely. So there's a lot you can do with MARC once you get it out of MARC. So today that's what we're going to be talking about. MARCEDIT is a very useful tool. At the end of my slides, I do have other resources besides MARCEDIT. If you want to try some of those, there's some Java tools out there for breaking MARC, for getting it out of MARC. There are a few other projects out there that are looking at how to break MARC, and so that you can work with it in other ways. Typically, when you are breaking MARC, almost all the projects that I've seen so far are generating MARCXML in the middle, and we're going to talk more about that and look at some examples. So we're going to today get grounded in terms of, I call it break it to make it. We're going to get really grounded in sort of the idea of breaking MARC records and how we're going to then approach data, and we're going to look at some examples. So I've pulled together as many examples I could, and also some things about MARC that you may, if you've been doing some data manipulation or some editing in MARC, you may not have looked at some of those other tools. So I want to point out some of those other tools too. I think MARCEDIT is very, very useful because, one, it's built, it's built by somebody who's built by one of us. It's built by somebody who works with libraries and librarians and understands MARC. So, it is probably one of, besides RIMMF, for sort of playing with records and creating records and training purposes, like RDA and things like that. But I think it's one of the tools that is, besides Gary Strawn's, if you're a Voyager library, Gary Strawn has a lot of good tools that he's built too. But I think in terms of an overall tool that we can all use, MARCEDIT is probably one of the most robust and really well developed. So it's been around for a while, and we're going to kind of go through it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape of where we are. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time. I think we all know where we are, but just sort of to get our minds in the place. And then we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities in MARC. I don't want to focus too much on the challenges. I think we know. If you've been cataloging for a while, or you're a systems librarian, or you've been trying to figure out how you can do something in your ILS, you probably have hit some of the issues that come up with MARC. It served us well for its 50-something years of service, so I think we're doing pretty good. So we got to give ourselves a pat on the back for that. But there are some opportunities with MARC, and once we get it out of MARC, then we can do so much more. And then we're going to go through just sort of the MARCEDIT and look at some of the things you can do and your questions as we go along. I'm going to go ahead while we're here, and I'm going to write down very quickly regular expressions so I can make sure that we talk about that in one of the upcoming sessions, because that will be very useful information. So where are we? Well, we're somewhere in here. We have a lot of different bits of metadata that we work with. We're generating metadata, it's everywhere. There's linked data projects. This is actually a linked data landscape, but I just love the fact that there's all these different projects out there that are just out there generating their metadata, generating their linked data. But we have very similar projects as well, where we are doing the same sorts of things. We're all out there generating data and doing things. So our landscape, should we do it from the MARC lens, would look sort of similar to this. It would be, we just overlap all over the place. And that's what I really love about that diagram, is it's just we're just overlapping all over the place with metadata. So where we are, what we're trying to do, we try to do a lot of different things with with our records and our catalogs. We try to describe the item we have. That's really what we focus on mostly when we're doing our cataloging work, or if we're doing institutional digital library work, we're really trying to accurately describe that record so that people can find it. The other part of it is that we do use our records to provide that inventory and tracking control. We have the record IDs, we have the barcodes, we have circulation records, item statuses, the orders that have all the links along the way. So we do provide that inventory and tracking control portion of it. And then we also provide ways for people to access the materials we have using URLs, using call numbers, locations in our buildings, is it in reference, where is it, that kind of thing. And then we help our patrons to really find what they are looking for. And that really fits into, that last one fits into the Ferber task, and I know we could spend a lot of time talking about Ferber tasks, but I think it's one of those things where it's good, especially when we're thinking about moving forward and thinking about how we're going to use metadata in the future and how we're going to get past MARC. And for some of you who've been working with Dublin Core and working with institutional repositories, or working more with a digital library project or with a web project, you're working with the discovery service, maybe you're on the user interface group or something like that, you may be thinking about these Ferber task a lot just in the course of what you're doing. What are we doing? How are we able to make sure that people can find stuff? And actually, having just gone through a system migration, we just made it over the migration part, so we're just a few weeks under our belt right now. I'm finding that some of these user tasks that we have, that we think of as like users, the public, we are struggling with some of these user tasks as we go in and are trying to search and find things in our new systems. Sometimes what we're looking for, we need to use a different search parameter in, our search, or maybe we need to use a different way of searching because we're sharing a bibliographic record now, which that's a completely different topic, and it's an interesting, provides opportunities and challenges again, pros and cons again, but that we also fit into this. How do we know that we're looking for what we want to find when we're trying to find data in our catalog, when we're trying to actually look at the data and we're looking for things. We want to run a report. Are we able to find those records that we're looking for and to be able to pull them together? And then when we find records, are we able to say, yes, this is the record that I'm looking for, and then to be able to select those records and all that kind of thing. So we also, although we usually think of Ferber task as the users at large, our users, the public, the patrons, our students, our faculty, whoever it may be, whoever our community members are, we usually think of the Ferber task as being that, but these also apply to what we're doing when we're looking at data and when we're looking at records and how we are going to, put our sets together and how we're going to figure out which records we're going to choose. Now, sometimes our records kind of choose us. Somebody comes to you and says, oh, I found this problem, or I have a question about this record. This record says this, but then the holding says something else. And then you realize, oh, well, if it's like it for this record, maybe there are more of them. And so how do I go about finding if there are more problems like this particular one that someone brought me? Or maybe someone says to you, we would really like all of our multi-volume sets to have a contents note if they can. We've noticed a lot of them don't, and that would be useful. Someone comes to you and asks, and you think, well, how do I know which records in the catalog are multi-volume sets that don't have table of contents? How would I find that? How would I identify those? And then once I identify them, how do I go about pulling them together in a report so I can work on them? And is there anything I can do to batch any of that work? Now, for table of contents, chances of batching that work probably non-existent because each one of them are going to be different, but there may be other things you're looking at, and we're going to look at some of the things as we go through in terms of what MARCEDIT can do and talk more about when you can batch edit and when you can't. But we also engage in these Ferber tasks when we are doing our our work. Of course, we know that we are limited with MARC. I do think one of our biggest challenges with MARC is that we do not have a lot of programmers outside the library world who know MARC, so we are not able to tap into all of those wonderful people that work for, Google and Facebook and all of these small, pop-up startups, things like that. All of these great programmers that are out there building all kinds of things. Most of them are not going to even know, have never even heard of MARC. So, it's a challenge because we do not have that wealth of programming resources out there to be able to tap into. And when we need help, there's not a whole bunch of people out there in the community to help us. We do have people, like Terry and some of the others, and Code for Live is another place where you'll find some of those systems programmers, cataloger programmers, library programmers, those types of people. But I would still say we're a pretty small minority in the larger library world. MARC is really not a web-friendly language, and so it means we have a tendency to be siloed in terms of our data. There's a lot of reasons in terms of why MARC records really don't display well, if at all, in Google, but one of the reasons is the MARC itself. I do think that we've gotten better with RDA, but I still find that there is not as much granularity as I would even like with RDA. You see this challenge with ebooks. People want to be able to say that, how do I tell someone this ebook is an Amazon or is a Mobi format or whatever thing it is, so that people know what kind of software that they might need or what kind of reader they might need. Because we're not device agnostic for ebooks, we've I think gotten much better for MP3s and audio music and things like that. I mean, there are still differences and things like that, but for a while, music was really tied to which device you were listening to, and then sometimes it was tied to, you only got so many licenses per device and all of that kind of thing. And we're there with ebooks now. So, I think even with the advances we've made in RDA, because of the challenges of working with digital objects, and right now I think ebooks and e-resources are sort of the biggies. And then when you look at sort of those emerging technologies, virtual reality, and then do we call it augmented reality, virtual reality, interactive reality? There's still a lot of discussion that's sort of in the community about, what do we call things? And all of that. So, then you start talking about describing those things and things get even more complex. The other part is digital materials are used by other communities besides libraries. So if you start looking at metadata standards, there are standards for manufacturing industrial equipment. In fact, there's a lot of standards, and manufacturing has a lot of standards. And so if you're really into metadata and you just want to go look at all kinds of interesting standards and things like that, just start wading around in some of the NISO stuff, and you'll start seeing all kinds of interesting standards. There's also the metadata registry that you can look at, and there's all kinds of things in there. There's schemas. There's a schema for beer. That's a fun one. It defines things down. I don't know much, but it defines things down to what kind they are, and all kinds of things like that. But I just think that one's kind of funny. But there really are metadata standards and schemas for all kinds of things, and so those have kind of risen up around us. And for those of you who work with digital objects and institutional repositories, you may very well see some of those other metadata standards more so than those of us who work with more traditional print and electronic materials that are bought by libraries. But there's lots of metadata schemas out there. So, this is sort of where we are. And it may look a little different in different browsers and different clients. I know it does, but they all kind of look something like this if they're a formatted MARC record. We'll look in just a few minutes about what a MARC record that's unformatted looks like, but it's just one continuous string. So That is a little bit of a challenge as well, so to get it kind of in a format. Of course, we do have some things that we're working on to sort of break through some barriers. Of course, now the 260 has been replaced by the 264, so that gives us a little more granularity there and a little more way of being able to break out information. But we do have some new fields too to help us with that information. So I think one of the challenges, though, when you're working with MARC records, especially if you want to move them into, you want to migrate your MARC records, or you want to import or ingest, you want to have like a discovery service, maybe you're using Summon or VuFind or EDS, something like that. You want that discovery service to go out and find your MARC records and then display them back, or you want to move records back and forth between your institutional repository and your your ILS. You want your ILS to have those records in the institutional repository records in there as well. So I think one of the challenges of being able to move records back and forth, and also data migration of data going forward into new systems, is that what we think of as a library catalog record, what we think of a MARC record, is really more of a composite. It's really made of a couple of different pieces. It's made of the ISBD, which is the punctuation that's all throughout it. We don't really, a lot of our ILSs now probably could do away with some of that punctuation. We might not even need it. Certainly going forward, if we start looking at moving our records into XML and reformatting them into XML, we will see that when we look at some examples and things like that, you'll notice that you're not seeing punctuation in them. So, punctuation serves its purpose in a MARC record. It is a very old holdover, and it's also meant to help make our records a little more human readable. Do people really sit around and read MARC records in our catalog? Probably not. But it is meant to help the system determine where to break things and also how to punctuate things. So, and for it to make it a little more human readable for us. So there's that aspect. Of course, then we have the MARC, and we have fields and tags and subfields. And then, of course, we have, what we're going to display and how we're going to display things. And then the other part of it is the actual text, our description that we put into those fields. So, that's kind of where we are and where the rest of the world is. So when you look at the web at large and you look at things like institutional repository software, really all kinds of other software projects that are out there. So when you have something like an ILS, you have the sort of the front end that the public sees, and that is pulling from a database. So you sort of have two parts of it. It's almost like a website on the front end and then a database running on the back end. And so typically we work in sort of this area in the middle. We call it the back end a lot of times, but it's the non-public side, and it will have a bunch of forms in it and things like that. And that's where we have our MARC templates that we work with. And if you're like me and you're working on a MARC record, most of the day or a good portion of your day, you're not really thinking about when you open a MARC record, you log in, you pull up the software, your ILS software, and you open a record. You don't think about the fact that that record is templated. You just see it as a MARC record, and you don't think about the ISBD part of it unless it's missing punctuation or something's wrong with it. That's just part of the MARC record for you. But the reality is, the MARC record you're seeing is pulling from a database that's on the back end of it. So even if you're an OCLC, we hear about how many records are added to OCLC and things like that. That means records going into the OCLC database that's on the back end. So regardless if you're writing a post for Facebook, or if you're writing a blog post or a WordPress blog, or you are creating a record or editing a record, the back end of where that information is going is a database. So there is that commonality between what we do with our ILS and all of these other projects that are out there. And I'm sure the Facebook, and in fact, the Facebook database is probably many multiple databases that work together. I don't know that I don't know anything about the database structure except there is a database structure behind it. So, we do have that similarity with other organizations and other sites on the web. The other aspect of it is then what builds the front end of that? So what builds that display? So when we create our MARC record, what creates the display on the front end? And so, for example, I taught a workshop last year, and it was to a public library group, and we were talking about XML, and we were talking about the display of MARC records and things like that. And so I was talking about MARCXML, and we're going to talk more about MARCXML as we go along here. But I was asking them, like, how many of them had worked with MARC or MARCXML or XML itself, just to kind of get a sort of a lay of the landscape, what people have done. And one of the programmers that was in that group, everybody was like, no, haven't worked with XML, really haven't worked with MARCXML. And one of the programmers in the back of the room spoke up and said, well, but when you work with a MARC record, in order for it to be displayed to the public, it actually gets converted to a MARCXML. It's completely done behind the scenes. The cataloger had no idea, truly. So the MARC record that the cataloger works on just looks like a regular old MARC record, just like we looked at there. And then behind the scenes, the software turns it into MARCXML, and then that XML that is generated with the MARC tags and stuff is then formatted and sort of prettied up using what would be called a style sheet. So sort of prettied up for display to the public. And I thought, wow, how interesting that is that that process sort of happens behind the scenes and they don't really see that or really even realize it happens. They just go look at it in the public view, the OPAC, and there's their record and it's all pretty and things like that. And that happens for many ILSs now. It's not true for all ILSs, but a lot of ILSs, because there is the website on the front end, what the public is looking at, it will have to have some sort of markup language because that's how the web works. It has to have some sort of markup language on the front side of it. So even some of the oldest ILSs, you may be working in a MARC record, but then there is a process then to take that MARC record and push it into some kind of markup language so that then it can be displayed to the public. So it could be HTML. These days, it's more likely to be XML because that's sort of become the standard for a lot of this. So, even if you think, well, I might not really work with XML, or I don't know, there's a good chance that your ILS, in the process, if you save the MARC record, you are working in a MARC record, but then on the back end, the MARCXML part happens, and then what's generated to the public is that XML, or a prettied up version of XML. And it could be then generated as like what they're seeing could be like an HTML file. It could be all kinds of different kinds of files. You can pull it into a content management system like Drupal or WordPress or something like that. But once you get it into XML, then you can do lots of different things with it. So it can be styled and prettied up and all kinds of things. So that's what we have to do when we want to work with our MARC data. If we want to work with it and be able to do batch processing and other sorts of things like that, we have got to get it into a format where we can really manipulate and do stuff with it. Now, it's true, your ILS may have tools that will allow you to do batch editing. Alma has the ability to create sets of records, and then you can do some batch processes within Alma, and you don't have to have any sort of, you don't have to break the MARC, you don't have to do anything else to it. You just work within Alma. And there's other ILSs that have similar projects. Voyager has the Gary Strong Toolkit, and again, it just works directly with the MARC records, and so it's all seamless in terms of that. So there may very well be tools that you use within the system that are doing data manipulation and things like that. You don't need to have, you don't need to take the records out and do something to them and then put them back. But in terms of being able to do more with records, you really typically you're going to want to get them out of your system so that you can do stuff. So a markup language really is a language that tells the computer, and it tells really the whole World Wide Web. It tells us the structure of a document, and then it tells information, it conveys information that will let the web search engine, or what they call the spider, the crawler, will give it information to tell it to index or not index. That's sort of basic website 101. Do you index or not index this page, this information? And then how are you going to display it? And then if you have, there are some things that are, it will actually transform the text. So you can put instructions in for like reading devices and things like that. So, but this is typically invisible. It's not something that we often get to see unless we do something like this. And it's certainly something that most people aren't even aware that happens. It's just sort of magic. You search in the ILS and you get a MARC record, what appears to be a record. And I would say too that more increasingly so, we're seeing the public sees less of the sort of actual MARC record. It's just seeing pieces that search or discovery tool is pulling out. So it doesn't see all the fields and things like that. In fact, typically you have to go look at the technical display or the MARC field display or the staff view or something like that in order to be able to see what the MARC record actually looks. Now, MARC can be expressed because XML is very flexible. It can be used for a lot of different things. It can be used for website things. It can be used for generating like APIs, and if you use Google Reader or any of those early sort of RSS feed reader things, a lot of that stuff relied on XML. So there's a lot of, XML is used for a lot of different things. It's also used for a lot of mobile device programming. It's really just sort of a carrier. So remember that when you have a markup language, it really just does a few things. It tells the computer or the device what the structure of the thing is. It gives it some instructions. It tells it whether or not it's going to index it and how, usually. And then it'll tell it, like, how are you going to display this information that I provided you? And what might you need to do with it? So it's very sort of generic in terms of the overall what it can do. And because of that, we can actually use XML to just write MARC. And so we can even put our tags in and subfields and all that kind of stuff. Writing MARC in XML like this from scratch would be a very tedious process. And if you want to do that, you just go for it. Have fun with it. But it will take you a while, and it will be a little bit of a tedious process. But it's a good way to kind of learn and see, like, how would you code and tag these. If you've not done any website coding anytime before, then some of the structure will look a little strange. Instead of, I'll turn on my arrows here, instead of having, just our indicators, we have to remember, we have to have some instructions. And what are we going to do with those things? So that's really what, when we're looking at MARC, that is really what we are looking at. So, we're telling it, and there's even more up here. This is just a snippet of just one field. This is how we would sort of code one field. So there's a lot more information we would tell the software or the website or whatever. So much more that we would tell it up here. But just to display the 264, we would have to tell our software, okay, this is the 264. Then since we have indicators, we would have to give it that information. And then we're going to have to tell it not only what each of these things are, but then what information goes there. So we would just, kind of go all the way through for a MARC record. Now you can see this would be a pretty tedious process. The other thing is that it does follow traditional website coding. If you've done HTML markup or any kind JavaScript, any sort of programming stuff. WordStar, when I was a student worker, there was a really old dinosaur of a machine that was a WordStar word processor. Yeah, I'd never seen one before, but anyway, it just did the one thing, and it had like one report that it printed. And apparently that was the only way they could get this particular report to print. And so I had to go in and use the bracketed commands to tell the machine, print this report and what report it was and then what format to print it in. So, it's very similar to this sort of web coding, but essentially you turn off and on. So here we have the subfield code C, we have the information that we're going to display, and then we are going to turn off the subfield. Things can be nested, and so you see up here we had our data field, we turned it on, so turn it on, there's nothing there. And then to turn things off, you're using that backslash that says turn it off, we're done. It is a hierarchical process within XML. So you have sort of, in this case, you have data field, subfield, and then you have the value being sort of what we would typically write in our description. So like New York, New York would be our value. Now we have, in this particular case, we've put the punctuation in because the punctuation would not display otherwise. So when you're looking at XML, XML is not going to put punctuation in unless you either tell it to put punctuation in. So you could have some programming that would say if you have a subfield, then you are going to put punctuation at the end of the subfield. That might be one thing. Of course, now with MARC, we don't always put the period at the end of every subfield. So you can see where that would cause problems if someone tried to code it in. So it may be that the answer would be, rather than try to code in exceptions, you just include it as part of the text and it just reads it as text. It's sort of one of those programming challenges, and I know people have worked this out and worked around it, but it is something that kind of is a MARC thing where we have exceptions sometimes, but other times things are very consistent, and so how do you program for that? But it is a hierarchy, and it follows a data field, and then your subfields, and then the values that you're actually going to include, and then then you close everything out. So it has to be sort of like a little nest egg. Back when you would do, you might have written mathematical equations and you would have to put everything in parentheses and then you would make sure with the order of operations, that kind of thing where you put and close everything in the order of operations. So, that is, that's sort of the way it works. So that's a very, very quick overview of how markup languages work on the web and also for the XML part of it. For MARCEDIT, you don't need to be able to write XML from scratch, so we don't have to worry about that. There's lots of good tools there, but I did just want to give you sort of a basic overview of XML so that as you're thinking about what you're doing, and also, if you are looking at migrating to a new system, or maybe you're part of some sort of user interface or usability testing group, or, you could be part of any, I'm looking at all the various things you all have worked on. So all the various different things that you work on, understanding a little bit about that structure of XML can be helpful. So I think of MARCXML as the translator. It's been around for a good long while now, and like I said, it is increasingly used more between what we do and what's displayed to the public. We don't see the MARCXML, and we don't even have to do anything. It just sort of happens by magic on the back end. It's nice when I can say it happens by magic. But it does seem to be like magic when it's working. When it's not working, that's a real big issue. So, sometimes understanding a little bit more about the interaction between what you're doing with the MARC record and the interaction on the public side is very useful as well. I know one of the things when we were looking at the public interface, we were looking at a new user interface, and we were struggling as a group to look at how our MARC records, we weren't struggling as a group to look at how our MARC records displayed. We were struggling with being able to understand why they displayed the way they did in some situations. And one of the things had to do with the punctuation. And so we had double punctuation on some fields that we shouldn't, just various things like that. And that was sort of an early draft of a user interface that we were looking at. And, understanding more about how XML works and understanding more about what we do on the MARC side, it made it a little bit easier for us than to go in and kind of dig around in some of the documentation and see why it was doing those things. So having that understanding, I think as we go forward increasingly into these more complex ILSs, we want our users to be able to find things. We want to be able to find things, but we also do want the information that's displayed to the public to make sense and also to sort of have some consistency in terms of punctuation. So even if we choose at some point, if we choose or you choose to go away from ISBD because of your ILS you're using, then you would still want to think about things like spacing and how are you going to display fields without fields? Are you going to include a label, author, title, that sort of thing? And how will that be spaced? Where will you include punctuation to help the user or not? So there's a lot of pieces just to the punctuation part and how it displays. But MARCXML is, to me, I consider this to be sort of the big translator tool. Not only does it help the ILS display our records to the public and to be able to pull out bits of the MARC record and display it to the public. So it kind of does two things. You can either just sort of generate a MARC record and pretty it up, and there's your MARC record as a whole. Or you can, some of the discovery tools and the OPACs will just pull out things like, okay, we're going to do the brief record. So we're just going to pull out the title, author, call number, and location. And maybe that's all we're going to include in the brief record. So it's going to pull out those MARC fields and then pretty them up using some markup, some sort of pretty that part of it up to display to the public. So MARC can do a couple of different things. It can allow our records just to be translated right on through as they are. It can also allow another software or system to come in and just pull certain fields, because it just goes in and reads the XML fields and it just pulls those fields and then can repackage them. It also allows us to be able to take our records and be able to manipulate them and put them back into the original MARC formula. And so I think that for the kinds of things that we typically are interested in doing, data cleanup, maybe making records, RDA records, things like that, all of those sorts of things, MARCXML can help us, because the other aspect of it is it allows us to put those records back into MARC so we can then put them back into our catalogs or back into our institutional repositories or digital libraries. So whatever software we're using, it allows us to put those records back into that MARC format. So that's the powerful part of it. So you can use MARCXML for a lot of different things, and we will be continuing to talk more about MARCXML as we kind of go along in the future. But the important thing is we've got to get out of the MARC in order to be able to use MARCEDIT and be able to do more things with our records and make them more interchangeable, make them more harvestable. They can go from one repository to another, ILS to repository, all of those kind of things. It also helps us with authority work if we don't have authority tools already in our ILS, or we don't have the ability, we don't have the funding to be able to outsource authority work. We can do authority work using MARCEDIT, and we're going to talk more about that as we kind of go forward about how you can do that. You can even do some linked data stuff with MARC records once you get them out of MARC. So we just have so much that we can do. We can code records using the markup and still include MARC information. We can do that in XML. Or we can also then do things like the linked data where you're linking out to a controlled vocabulary. So there's lots of different things we can do. So why use MARCEDIT? This is what we're here today to talk about, really, is MARCEDIT. Why would you use MARCEDIT? You may, for those of you who've used MARCEDIT, if you have other things I can add to my slide, Please share them with class. Some of the things I think about is batch editing vendor records. I think about ebook records all the time, it seems like these days. So, batch editing vendor records. We also purchase some, we do some shelf ready stuff. So I want to look more, we're just negotiating a new contract, so I want to look more at what our records look like and what we can do with MARCEDIT. I am now in a shared system catalog, so that's been interesting. Certainly MARCEDIT is going to be one of my go-tos besides OpenRefine in the next couple of months as we try to clean up some big post-migration issues. So if you migrate, if you're planning a migration, if you've not been through a migration before, I will just give you a few pieces of advice and hope for those of you who might not have done it before. Clean up as much as you can before you migrate. Realize that migration will cause other issues that you couldn't possibly identify at the time. Patience and kindness is the name of the game. It may take a little while for people to get comfortable working in the new system. You may also stumble across things where the new system doesn't work the way you think it will. You have some new opportunities and ways of doing things. If you're moving to a shared system where you're sharing a bibliographic record, that has its own set of challenges. And I can do a whole session on that at some point. But that has its own set of challenges. And the other part of it is to then you will want to look at what you can do post-migration once you get your workflows in place, because workflows will change to a certain extent regardless what system you go to. There is no way that it will not impact at least a few of your workflows. The big workflows may stay the same, the staffing may stay the same, at least temporarily, but you may find a couple of years after migration, oh, we can do this now. And so we'll batch process more, or we can cross-train people to do other things, or maybe there's more efficiencies that you'll find. Or you may find initially that it is much less efficient because you're still learning how to use the software. Or you may find that the software is early in development, and so maybe you're going to be heavily involved in testing and development of the software, and you may find that it slows work down a little bit. So it's an interesting process, and I think even when you're migrating from a system that seems or even an upgrade sometimes, you may gain functionality or lose functionality within those upgrades, and you may also find things that need to be cleaned up then. So that's my, in a nutshell, what to look for when you're migrating. We'll talk more about migrations going forward, though. Other things you can use MARCEDIT for, you can use it as a cataloging tool, as a cataloging helper. We're going to talk about that. I already mentioned database cleanup. Linked data projects, if you want to explore some of those. You can get record sets from some of these big linked data projects, and then you can play with them in MARCEDIT. So if you're interested in doing that, I know there's some BibFrame records out there you can play with, and there's other records out there for some of these other projects you can play with. RDA help, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Basically, if you have repetitive editing to do, if you have the same field over and over that you need to fix, and we're going to talk about some of those, but if you have the same field over and over and over you need to fix, consider automating. Automate your life. I'm such a fan of automate. It is going to be your friend, especially if you're either getting ready for a migration or you're post-migration and looking at your records and thinking, oh gosh, we've got some things we need to clean up. So what is MARCEDIT? It's free. That's the best thing to say about it. It's desktop software, so you will need to install it. You may or may not need help from IT, but it is something that you'll need to install. It does work on Windows. It's really a suite of tools, and you'll see that, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward. It's most useful for working with largest, and it depends upon how large your files are. So, I've worked with ILSs that were 5 million records and 500,000 and 100,000. So, it depends upon, large is relative. When you're 5 million records, large is like 4 million. When you're 100,000, large is like 50,000 probably. So, it depends, large is relative. It also depends upon, since it runs on your computer, it depends upon what your processing speed is and also your storage speed on your storage space on your computer. So if you are generating huge MARC files, and also some records are larger than others. So if you're working with records that have very large summary notes and table of contents, things like that, like thesis and dissertations, a lot of times we have these very, very long summary notes and content notes and abstracts and things like that. If you're working with files like that, records like that, then even if you only have 10 records, they may be much larger than, say, just a book record may be. So, it kind of depends upon what the nature of your file is to begin with, how big it is, what your record looks like, and then, it's all relative compared to what you're doing. So the other part of it is, because it is on your desktop, you may hit limitations in terms of what your desktop can handle. That's up to you and your desktop and your IT person. I do think it's helpful if you have smallest batches, like if you have 100 things that need editing. I think that's actually a nice little group because it's easier for you to check and verify and make sure it's working. So I'm actually a fan of, rather than putting a bunch of records together and making very large files, I'm much more, if you're starting from scratch, I'm much more of the start with smallish batches that need work and be able to verify that it's working correctly and then proceed there in just small chunks. Because that's the other part of it too, since it's on your desktop, if you don't have a lot of memory or maybe processing speed, then working with smallish batches, you don't want to lose records and assume that they got fixed. You want to make sure that you actually get all your records. And so smallish batches, to me, is sort of the better practice. Of course, if you're getting large files from your vendor, then that's probably what you're going to be working with. But if you can break them down in some way, I think that's easier to work with in MARCEDIT. It can be used to just break records, so you don't have to do these other processes with it. We're going to talk about the other processes, but you don't have to do them. You can just break the records and then use them in other ways. We talked about data cleanup already. It works with OpenRefine. I know a few people have already dipped their toe into OpenRefine, so we're going to be talking more about OpenRefine in the future, and we'll talk a little bit more about MARCEDIT and how it works with OpenRefine. I've seen both that there was a Mac version, and then I'm on a list with Terry, and he said he was working on the Mac version, so maybe the Mac version was for the latest version of MARCEDIT. I'm not sure. So MARCEDIT, their latest version that was July 10th. So if you have MARCEDIT, you'll be getting a note that there's a new version. That was just released on July 10th. So you should get that update that it's on the way. So it may be that there's not a Mac version for. I'm sorry, I'm not a Mac person. I have worked on a Mac before, but I'm not a Mac person. Don't have a Mac access to test this. So if someone is a Mac person and using MARCEDIT, I would be interested to know what version you're on and whether or not it worked. Because I did see that there were earlier versions of MARCEDIT that were Mac, but I didn't see anything listed for later. And Terry had said that he was working on the Mac version, but maybe that's for the 6.3 July release. In a nutshell, the reason why this is so useful is it's a way for non-programmers to be able to create defined task lists, and then you can just run them and sort of execute them automatically. And it really eliminates some of the work that we would have to do. So how do you get started? Well, you've got to go to, and the links are in the presentation, so you'll have them all. You're going to download the MARC installation package to your desktop. It does come with a self-installer. As I noted before, you may or may not need help from IT. That's between you and your IT. Some places do, some places don't. Actually, and even if you're in one single institution, you may have some things where you can install, some computers where you can, others you can't. So, it just varies. You will if you're an Alma user. Let me ask, are there any Alma users here? Anybody besides me who's an Alma user? Anyone? Well, if you are an Alma user, or if you use some other software that has an API where you can get records, and this may be for you digital repository, institutional repository, digital library people, this may be of interest to you as well. Because if you have an API and you can get records through your API, so you know that harvesting thing that I was talking about, you can get records through an API, then you may be able to integrate it directly with MARCEDIT. And I'm going to show you that just in case you're in that situation. So that's a heads up for those of you who are institutional repository, digital library people, or ALMA people, any of you, or anyone else who has an API interface in their ILS where they can get records. And you know if you do. And if you don't, you can ask your IT person or your systems admin. They may be able to tell you that as well. The installations will create shortcuts for you, so that's very easy. MARCEDIT will process any valid MARC file, and that is useful because there are a lot of different ILSs. When you start exporting records, it will give you, might try to put them in a text file or a DAT file or an MRC file. I use MRC files for OCLC, so it could be that. To edit records, the first thing you've got to do anything really in MARCEDIT other than just explore and play, but if you want to actually edit records, you've got to find your MARC file and then you've got to change the extension. And this isn't all of the materials that Terry has put together and all of the presentations you might find and help and things like that. But you've got to change your extension. When you are done with your records, you're going to have two choices. At that point, you've broken your records. So I love that we call it breaking MARC. But anyway, you've broken your records. The data is still good. It's just not MARC anymore. So it's not been constrained by MARC. It is now in MARCXML. So you have your records in that MARCXML, and we're going to look at your choices. But when you're done, then you can do a few things with them. You can either export your records into a different, you can even do them into a different schema if you wanted to, but you could export your records and then do whatever you want to with them. Or if you want to put them back into your ILS, at that point you have to compile them and then kind of get them back into that MARC format. Terry has a really good tip, and I am such a fan of keeping what you're working on separate from your original version. I just think this is good web practice. It's good programming practice. It's just kind of good. We do this with Word documents sometimes. You have the original and then other people are working on, sort of a copy so that, if there's any question, you can always go back to original or see the version and things like that. There's not really version control within the within MARCEDIT, so you don't really have the ability to roll back. You have some undos, and we're going to talk about that. So there's some ways you can do that, but not really the sort of version control that we think of sometimes. But being able to just rename things and sort of separate the two is just, to me, very good practice, because then you'll always have your original file. And so then if something goes wrong, you can go back to your original file, or should you decide you want to do something different with your original file, then you can. You have those files just as they were. So I think that's a good idea. So MARCEDIT really is a suite of tools. You can use it to edit MARC records. You can use it for validation. You can use it to convert to MARC. You can use it to convert to various XML MARC-based markups, and you can even write your own scripts, which I think is really, really pretty cool. It has lots of plugins. We're going to look at those going forward. And just as a reminder, and I'm going to probably say this over and over again, but they have to be broken from MARC first. And that's sort of the first step to get going. I think sometimes we get real excited about being able to do this and we forget we got to do we got to get them out of the MARC before we can really move forward. So there are built-in MARCXML tools within there, and you see you can translate the MARC into all these great things. You can also go the other way. So if you have XML, so for those of you who are institutional repository, digital library people, content management, whatever you may be doing, finding aids, if you have records that are any of these other formats, if you can get them into an XML record, then you can put them into a MARC record. Now, that's not to say it's going to be a beautiful MARC record or it will be a complete MARC record, because there is some, and we'll talk more about mappings. And for those of you who have done some of my other metadata workshops and things like that, we've talked a lot about how do you map between different metadata schemas. That's still going to be an issue if you're going in either direction. So if you're taking your record from a MARC record and putting it into Dublin Core, you may find that not all your fields are going to match up. You're not going to be able to map them one-to-one. You're going to have to make some decisions about where you put information, and the same goes the other way. If you're starting with a Dublin Core record that's an XML and you want to turn it into a MARC record, you may find you have missing data or data that just doesn't go where you think it should. So you're going to have to do a little bit of mapping and tell your systems. Once you get the files, you're going to have to tell your systems where to put things. RDA Helper is another useful tool, and we're going to look at that one too. Bad MARC. Bad MARC. So what do how can MARCEDIT help us just with like our junky MARC? And we all have junky MARC, so don't think you don't. There's probably some floating around in there if you haven't done some sort of system validation or cleanup, if you've done cleanup. How do we get things like this? Well, we get them from vendor records sometimes. I've seen awfully good vendor records, so I don't want to bash vendor records, but we do get them sometimes from vendor records. We may get them if we're going out and pulling records from, some of those open cataloging, open, sort of open educational projects, things like that. Typically, OCLC is not going to have as much of this because we can validate MARC. So, when we validate MARC, we're fixing a lot of this, or at least being alerted that we need to fix these things. So some of the things that it can do in MARCEDIT is it can help fix some of the MARC errors. And the two big buckets, it can look at structural errors in the MARC record. So is it overall formatted correctly? Can look at those things, and then can also look for missing fields, missing record markers, things like that. So it can look for sort of the basic structural parts of a MARC record and fix it. It's not going to necessarily be able to tell you that that 440 is obsolete and needs to be recoded as a 490 and 491-830. It's not going to tell you that, but it would tell you if you have it looking for particular things. It could alert you as to that field exists in your record. And we're going to talk about data analysis as a MARCEDIT tool as well. So a MARC record, I teased you about this earlier. What does it look like? Well, you can't possibly get a MARC record onto a PowerPoint without it truncating and, sort of squishing itself, wrapping. It doesn't truncate, but it wraps. Well, this is truncated and wrapped too, but it does both. But a MARC record is just a string, and I think one of the things that's the most amazing to me is all of this up here. And this is MARC is considered to be position based. So sometimes when you go in and you look in Bib's format, and this is the first position here, so it just really counts from there all the way to the end. So it is position based, and so each element of a MARC record is assigned a position number, and so that's something that makes MARC really challenging because there's not really a lot of systems out there that still do that. So a couple of tips working with MARC records and when breaking them and remaking them and things like that. MARCEDIT will accept any extension, any valid MARC extension. The output needs to be the MRK file, and so that's something that you'll need to adjust for. The other thing is if you're using a Unicode product, so I know Alma's Unicode, Voyager, at least my Voyager institution, I had migrated or converted to Unicode many years ago. But anyway, if it's using Unicode, then you're going to need to make sure that what you're outputting is also Unicode. If you're using OCLC, and you're looking at OCLC records and you import records, and maybe you don't know necessarily, but if you look under your system preferences in your ILS, you should be able to see what character set you're using in addition to the font, but the actual character set. You should be able to see that. But the other thing you can also do is when you open connection, if you import records back and forth, if you open connection and you actually go in and look under the system preferences and the user preferences and things like that, you'll see what your records are output as, and that will tell you if you're Unicode or not. So if you see UTF-8, that's a Unicode character set. And the reason why you need to make sure to be aware of that is because if your system is Unicode, it will most likely reject or not accept a non-Unicode font or non-Unicode character set. So it kind of has to be, if it's expecting to get Unicode and that's what it's requiring is Unicode, and you try to import a bunch of MARC records that you've worked on in MARCEDIT and you import them as a non-Unicode character set, it's probably just going to say, sorry, can't do anything, or it just might not even tell you anything. It just might not do anything. If it does try to do anything, it's going to be junky probably. I can't imagine, I don't know of many systems that would even be able to handle it without doing some conversion. So I wanted to kind of look through, we've talked a little bit about what it can do. I wanted to kind of, as we start diving in, I wanted to kind of point out some things you can do. So this is when you first log in, this is what you see, and there's help all over the place. Do you need help? There are plenty of places to find help. And I'm going to try to kind of just take you through some of the things that you may see here, and we'll talk about them and how they work, and then talk about some examples too. So if you need help, that little purple bucket over there with the saw and all the tools, that takes you over to Terry's MARCEDIT website. And that's where he posts news about upcoming versions and things like that. It also has links to, it has a sidebar with links to the tutorials and some of the other things that are out there. And there's also a knowledge base, so he's really done a lot of work on this. The what would you like to do? That's actually a search box, and you can just type in what you want to do, and it will help pop you to information. There's also a help menu too. And the help menu gives you links to, this is primarily links to things that are located on the MARCEDIT site. And so, there's information about whether or not you should, upgrade. There's information, online help, system information, how to set up your application shortcuts. You can check for updates there. So if you don't get an update message when you log in, you can always go there to check for updates. And then, of course, there's links to help there as well. So there's a lot of different ways to get help. In terms of sort of the top menu bar, there's a lot of tools that are up here, and there's sort of a multiple, they're sort of chunked up. So there's the MARC tools, and then you have the MARC editor and the various tools like that. I'm not going to go through all the tools, but I just wanted to kind of point out some of the things that you will find when you're looking through here. So, you have the ability here to take something that's a MARC record and then export it out. And then conversely, you can take that MARCXML record, and MARC21 is just the latest version of MARC that we're all using. We really should probably be saying MARC21 XML because it is the latest version, but you can take that XML record and generate it back to MARC. If you are using an older ILS, or you are using an older repository software, then this may make a difference. I don't know how significant the changes are between the MARCXML, the original MARCXML, and the MARC21 XML. I do know there are some changes. So if you hit problems or something's not quite mapping up, or you're having trouble getting your record set to import or export the way you think it should, then this may also be something that you need to look at to see whether or not you need another conversion tool in the middle to get it from, if you have some old version of MARC that's not accepted here, or conversely, the records you make are not accepted into your repository or software, then you may need to see if you can look at some of the other tools. And there's other tools at the end of the presentation that will help you with that MARC translation. So if for some reason you're hitting issues, this may be another place where you're hitting issues. So there's a lot of useful information and a lot of help all throughout, I think. Under tools, oh my gosh, what a list of tools. Now, some of these tools, it's interesting because on the earlier versions of MARCEDIT, and some of you may have remembered the big RDA helper button. On some of the earlier versions, you see things that may be different. You can do some configuration, so yours may even look a little bit different. This is the MARC 6.3, just kind of out of the box. I don't do a whole lot of customization to what I see here, but there are lots of tools, and one of the useful ones I find here is that we do have the ability to use that OpenRefine. So you can either import from OpenRefine or you can export to OpenRefine. And so if you have already broken your MARC and you've played with it and done whatever in OpenRefine, you can then, if you want to do some additional work using some of the MARC tools that are built in, so you could even do a two-step process. You could go in and do some of the things you might want to do in OpenRefine and do those first, if that's easier for you, and then you could take them into MARCEDIT and do more. Use some of the tools that exist, or you may want to use the tools that exist within MARCEDIT that are built in, and then you may want to export out. Some things you can do sort of out of the box that are very useful, and we're going to talk more. There are some conversion tools for the character sets. That's one of those things you'll just have to explore because it would only really apply to you if you don't have a match between the two character sets, like the Unicode and a non-Unicode. Chances are you should be able to find a way to do it in other ways, but that may be a choice for you as well. Of course, you can batch process records. You can export records. You can generate call numbers. That's kind of a cool thing. Now, that's not to say that you don't need to check them. But if you are cataloging, that's kind of a neat little tool that can help. Same thing with fast headings. I actually did fast headings for a project using MARCEDIT, and it was interesting. It was okay. I still had to do some work. It wasn't perfect. And of course, you can find duplicate records. So let's say you have, I would say less likely to happen in the ILS, but you might have duplicate records. Prior to the system migration to ALMA, we had 3 library catalogs that were merged together. And so we did have some duplicate records. And this is a very useful tool to help identify those duplicate records. There may be other ways to do it. You may just do you might do a query if you have access on the back end or some other kind of search mechanism on the back end, analytics or something like that. Search analytics, you may be able to find duplicate records that way. If not, then this MARCEDIT tool may be a good choice for you. If you have some thought that you may have some duplicate records. So that's a few of the tools. You can also join and split files. So I'm not going to talk too much about them, but there are some tools down here where you can merge records. I would be very careful with that and work in very small batches, but you can merge records together. You can also do some joining and splitting of your files too. You can also compare. So if you've got 2 files of MARC records and you want to see where you have overlap, you can do some comparison as well. So there's a lot of useful tools really just throughout. And then of course the RDA helper, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Lots of helpful things. Again, under the export, you have a few options that can help you in a lot of different ways. You can do just sort of an export MARC record, so sort of to prepare you for getting your MARC records. The other thing you can do is you can do tab delimited records, and if you've worked with Excel or you've worked with CSV files, or maybe you have done some harvesting from a repository to another, you can even, once you get data into a tab delimited record, you can do all kinds of things with it. You see tab delimited records used more probably for non-library uses. I'm thinking of like mail merge and data cleanup sort of database cleanup, things like that. But it could be useful in a lot of different ways. So that's kind of an interesting feature that people don't really think about. This is how you could get your MARC records into Excel, should you want to do that. Plugins. In addition to what's on the site, these are all freely available. You can download some additional plugins, and you see that some of them are managed and maintained by others. So Princeton has the Add Pinion. There's also a Generate Cutters. That's a very useful one too. There's the Internet Archive Tahathi Trust Packager. I don't know much about the other ones here, but there are some other plugins too that may be of use. If you are doing a lot of work, you can also contribute your own. So add-in, so in addition to plugins, so we have a bunch of different buckets of tools here. So we sort of have the big tools that are on the main menu, and then we have sort of the tools underneath the tool list, and then we sort of have an overlap between them. So if you want to do something, I would say the best way to really learn about MARCEDIT is just to go in and spend some time and to explore some of these tools. And if you have a file of records that you can use, you don't have to import them back into anything. You can just play with them and see how things work. You can also harvest OAI records, and there's also a way that you can do a work with batch harvesters too. So there is a lot that you can do. And then remember, I said that there was the build your own or make your own things. So that exists as well. And then there's also just a generic MARC validation tool. So there are a lot of tools that are built in to help you as you go along. If you are working with an ALMA API, I just wanted to kind of show you where you would set that up because I don't think it's super intuitive. Or some other API, you're going to go to that little settings box down there at the bottom, and that is where you're going to set up your API. Now, your API connection. You would need to know what the API is for the software on the other side. So that's one piece of information you would have to get. So if you're working with a digital library or an institutional repository, there should be somewhere in your settings where it tells you what the API is. That would be on the administrative side of your institutional repository digital library, but it should be something that's pretty easy to find. But once you get that API, that's typically the three pieces you're going to need are your API and your password and what username you're going to use to be able to make those connections. Once you have that all set up, and here's an example I just pulled from Terry's site that this is setting it up against, this is again for an ALMA example, but this would work for any other, you'll see some of the choices that we have. But essentially you give it a name, and then you have to have the host name. So that's something that you would know. You know, what's the address for where I'm going to get these records? What's the database name? And if you've ever set up a WordPress or Drupal or any sort of site where you have to input the database properties, this is actually the information that is on sort of the back end of the website server admin information. So they know what the database name is because they've set it up. So, you know, it may, if you don't know, then if you're working with someone who is is the site admin for an institutional repository or for your digital library software, you may not have access to this as your user account. You may not know what the host or the database name is, but that's something they should be able to easily provide for you. The syntax part of it, you may need to figure out a little bit, and we're going to look at some of the choices there. But for something like ALMA, you know, what the kinds of records we're going to be looking for and moving back and forth would be MARC 21, because that's the latest version of MARC. And then, of course, the username and password aren't filled in just because, you know, we don't fill those in publicly. And then you're going to finish your setup. And you see here that there's some you know, choices about what system you're using, ALMA, and because we've already chosen, you know, some of the information in terms of the ILS integration. So we've already chosen that. So we just go through and we just sort of fill in things. And you do have to have that 39.50 setting already set up. So that's sort of another piece. But there's good instructions on Terry's website about how to set this up when you get ready to do it. And, you know, like I said, it will work. This particular setup, exactly as we're looking at it, should work for most ILSs, provided there is the API on the other side. If you have a different way of accessing the ILS from the back end, then that may be something you would need to explore a little bit and poke around. But if you do have an API, and many of the more modern ILSs do have an API somewhere. You may not know where it is or know how to get to it, but it does have that API. And so you just input that. Once you set it all up and you set your 39.50 settings are set up, and that's a whole, it's not a, you can see this process is not really that time intensive. You just need to know what the information is. So once you put that information in, then what you will see is this lovely little link directly to that. And so in this particular example, we see a link in the MARC editor for ALMA and also one set up for OCLC WorldCat. So, you know, it can be very useful in terms of getting records back and forth. A couple of things to remember as you're working with records. You know, this is under the MARC tool. So getting started with the MARC tool. So let's say we've done this process, or we've exported records from our catalog. That's another way to do it. You don't have to use an API. An API just makes it easy for you to go pull records because it's going to go out. What's going to happen is MARCEDIT is going to go out and query the ILS that you're using and pull in records that way, as opposed to you having to import and export records. But certainly import and export is the way that MARCEDIT has originally worked. It's just this API thing's kind of a newish thing they're working on. So how would you do it if you're importing and exporting records? Well, if you're importing and exporting records, one, you've got to have a file. So you've got to have your record. So you'll have to figure out what criteria you're going to be looking for, how many records you want to pull, all of that kind of stuff. Make sure that you have your file and it's in one of those file formats like a DAT file or a bin or an MRC file. And then when you output it, you're going to make sure that you change it to that MRK file. But we're not outputting right now, so we're not getting them ready to export right now. We're just going to go get our records. So you're going to you know, have your file name. You're going to have your group of records based upon the criteria that you selected. It could be the first 50 records. It could be records missing a 650. You know, missing the subject headings. It could be whatever criteria you have pulled already in whatever query you are doing to identify records. So once you do that, you get your little group of files. It could be the vendor records that were just sent to you. Plop, here's your vendor records. You get your file and then you upload it. But the other things you're going to want to decide to do then is whether or not you need to do any functions in the meantime. So remember, you have to, in order to work with this, you have to break your MARC first. So there are some other things you can do. You can just use MARCEDIT as a Dublin core to a MARC converter. So that's all you want to do. I just want to get my records into Dublin core. You know, I've got a bunch of MARC records and I want to put them in the I want to put them in our institutional repository because they're all faculty works we've cataloged. So you can just, you know, get your import file based upon that criteria. Here are all the books that have been written by our faculty. And I've got my little group of files of those things. And so I am going to, you know, take my MARC record, my little file, and then I'm just going to run it through the MARC to Dublin core. And that's all I'm going to do. So I'm going to upload my file, click on MARC to Dublin core, and then click execute. And that's really all I'm going to do, because then at that point, after it's finished, I am going to output it. And so that I can then export it into my institutional repository. Now, the other thing to remember, don't forget to figure out what character coding you have. So that's sort of one of those you have to kind of, once you start thinking about the character encoding and you get used to thinking about Unicode, you just kind of think of, it seems like to me, I'm always like, And Unicode's a really interesting thing because it impacts the web in so many different ways. So if you really want to get geeky into it, go read about Unicode and how it impacts web display and things like that. But it impacts web display. But it does more than impact web display. Unicode for us impacts whether or not our records are compatible with our ILS. The other things that it can impact is whether or not our diacritics display properly. See, there's a reason. So if you, like I said, if you really are interested in that kind of stuff, you can go really delve into Unicode, because it's not just us that gets impacted by whether or not we get diacritics and they display properly and things like that. That impacts all kinds of things out there. So Unicode is not just a library thing. It is a worldwide programming, everything. It's everything. It's everything from our phones to our web browsers. It's everything. So, when I say metadata makes everything happen, I think maybe Unicode makes everything happen, really, but we can put that under metadata. But you are going to want to make sure that when you are executing and converting your files, you are going to want to figure out if you need to translate them. So if you're, and how you want to translate them. So, if you have Dublin Core and it's going to require it to be in a Unicode font, then you're just going to make sure that you choose that before you execute so that you can get those files. It may not matter for a digital library repository, institutional repository software so much. They seem a little more flexible in terms of what they can accept. Because they're not just MARC-based. So it may not matter so much for that, but it's just something to be aware of that you may need to do. If you are going the other way and you're working with MARC, then you may really need to consider that as you go along. So remember RDA Helper under our tools? Wow, it can just do so many things. Again, you're going to, have broken your MARC first. And then you'll have that file. So you remember Terry's tip about name your file that you're working on something different from the original. Here's why you would do that. So that you'll take that file that you just worked on, that you've just broken into MARCXML, and then you're going to choose what you want to be able to do with it. You can even generate GMDs should you want to go that way. There's a lot of things that you can do. You can also, you have a list of fields that you can edit and things like that, so you can add to this. There's a lot more you can do. So wow, you can do a lot. So you can see where this could be a good little cataloging helper. Should you have, let's say you have a bunch of locally cataloged videos, and there are occasionally things that maybe they have questionable rights to, or there's these sort of odd things that we may not want to put into OCLC. We may not want to add them in terms of OCLC, or maybe it's a special collections thing, and you're not going to you're not going to circulate it, and you really want to kind of limit people being able to see it, but you want to, have it represented in your catalog, then maybe that would be one of those cases where you do a local record, but you still might want to include some of this information because it helps the findability of it for your users and your patrons. For example, in one of my libraries, they have a bunch of artwork by the art faculty cataloged. And so those records are AACR2, but it would be very useful, and we've been already talking about batch processing and doing work for the content media carrier, and then also for some of the other things that may be relevant to those materials. We're trying to see if we can group them by sculpture and paintings and photographs right now, kind of break those out so that we can see how we could maybe add a little more information beyond even that. But that would be a way that's a defined group of materials. I think there's about 350, but being able to batch add that information in. It's like, okay, here's all the paintings. So those would be kind of one group that would be very easy to add a 336, 337, 338 to, and then some of the other things that we may want to add to them as well. So we could upgrade, and those records are local records. They are not available in OCLC or anything like that because they're such a sort of unique item. And they're also kind of hanging around the library and things like that. So, it's not even things that would necessarily be that easy for people to find. But those are a whole different kind of challenge unto themselves. Other things that MARCEDIT can do, we're going to talk a little bit about, not all of these, but some of them. You can do replace all if you need to just replace, kind of go to it. You can add new fields. So add, delete, edit. You can do that pretty much with everything. You can do it with fields and subfields and indicators. You can swap fields. You can copy fields. You can create a task list so that you don't have to, if you want to, break your file up into a bunch of little files. And you can use that MARC split to do that. If you want to break it up into a bunch of little files, then you could do that. And then you could create your task list so that you just run the one operation and it does all those tasks at that one time. So, it's very useful in terms of that. RDA helper, we just looked at a little bit, and then of course link data, and then you can build new things too. Examples, and I'm not going to go into this too much. There is a special undo there. I call that the uh-oh button. It allows you to sort of roll back if you make some major changes. MARC join is a useful thing to combine multiple files of MARC records, but I think MARC split in some ways may be better because you may have, your files may be too big and you want to make them a little smaller, and you could split them up in that way. So there's a lot of useful things you could do. I think field count, and we're going to kind of talk more about, I want to show some examples. I'm trying to kind of get through some of this part of it, but field count is useful for analyzing records because one of the things you can do, and this is useful for pre-migration data review, you can look to see if all of your records contain a certain field. So let's say you wanted to know how many of your records did not have a 336. Then you could do a field count and see that. Of course, you'd have to do your records. Probably if your ILS, if your group of records is large, then you'd want to break it up. But then you could still, do some, either you could do a percentage if you want to know kind of like just general percentage, like, oh, I did 25% of our records and, 40% of them do not have the 336 fields, which means they're probably not an RDA record. You could do that kind of sort of analysis if you're interested in it, or you could do something that was more like, you wanted to just kind of see, you could do your whole database in little bunches and then kind of see like, okay, here's all the records, that are lacking these to kind of plan for projects. MARC validate, again, we talked a little bit about MARC validation, but that's a very useful tool as well. Your ILS may have MARC validation, but if you're going to export a big group of records, then you may not be able to run them all through MARC validation as a wholesale process. So you may just do the MARC validation on the MARCEDIT side. If you get vendor records, you may want to do MARCEDIT first. I know quite a few people who get vendor records, they push them through MARCEDIT, and then once they do the work in MARCEDIT that they want to do, including the validation, then they load them into their ILS. So that may be a process. For those of you working with digital libraries, institutional repositories, that may be the same thing too. If you harvest a bunch of records from another source, or you are creating a bunch of records, maybe you're having some kind of batch process that's automating, collecting metadata and creating those records, then you may want to run those through the MARCEDIT before you actually put them into your software. So, there's a lot of uses for why you might want to look at MARCEDIT. So we're going to look at just a couple of examples so you can kind of see how it works in real time. Couple of things you can limit by the MARC tag, which I think is very useful. And then, of course, you can do all the sort of what we'd expect to be able to do, replace, delete, or add. And so you can do these as a batch process. And that's the important piece of it, is the batch process piece, because it really does impact what you're able to do. So you remember when I talked about creating a task list? So you can either take an existing task list. So you can take a task list and you can make a bunch of other ones. You can also share them. You can export selected task lists so I can share them with other people that way. I can clone an existing task list. If I have a task list that works really well, but I just want to take out one part of it, I can clone it and then edit it. I can do that. I can rename all of that kind of thing. And you can even assign hotkeys. So if you say, I want to remove this field, I want to remove a field because we have a local field, so it's not in the RDA helper. I want to remove a field and I want to add those new fields, and then I want to do something else. Maybe add a genre subheading. Then you could do that using the using a hotkey and creating a task. So that's a useful sort of thing. So we're going to just look at an example of adding an 099 field for an audiobook. It's pretty easy. It walks you right through the process. You have the option of what you're going to do when you open your MARC batch editing tools. So this is the add delete, and they call them utilities. I think of it as a suite of tools, kind of like a little toolkit, but they're called utilities. So in the add delete field utility, what do we want to do? Well, in this case, we are going to look at adding information. So we want to do a few things. We want it to we're going to tell it where to insert the field, and then we're also going to make sure that matches the case. So we have a few things we want to do. The regular expressions, so we'll talk more about regular expressions, and made a note to do that. We can use a regular expression to do this work. We can also say only add this field if not present. So if this field has a 650, going back to my 650 adding subject headings example, if our field has a 650, skip it. Only add this 650 if one doesn't exist. Of course, now for subject headings, we would have to have already identified, and maybe you could do that by call number partially if you had a bunch of things that were cataloged. Let's say you had a bunch of you had a bunch of literature that was cataloged, so you have a call number and you sort of know which area, it's a PS, it's American fiction, that kind of thing. And so let's say that's all you want to do is assign a genre heading to it. And so, you're just very, very skeletal sort of thing. Then you could say for that group of materials, because I know what that genre heading would be for those, I'm going to add the field only if it's not present. So you can say that, or you can say if this field is present, then add this one. So there's a lot of you can really get granular about what you want to do. So you can kind of really work through this, and you may have to take some time to sort of set this up. But you just think about the work you're going to save in the long run, the time investment that you are making now, in terms of what you're doing, is going to save you so much time in the future. If you edit 50 records or 100 records in a matter of minutes, it would be less than minutes probably, depending on what you were doing and how big your records were and how fast your computer is. You got to put all those caveats in place. But if you edit 50 records in, let's say, 10 minutes, and of course that's provided you've already got your record file and everything. So let's say all in all it takes you a half an hour to get your records, get them into MARCEDIT, and decide what you're going to do, and 30 minutes to edit 50 records. That's a pretty good ratio of corrections made, and you can do multiple corrections at one time using this task list. So you can build your task list so that it will do multiple things to the records as it goes through. So, you can really, if you think about all the things you might have to edit on a record and how long it takes, but the key to it is making sure to define your record set and then to carefully think through exactly what you're going to do using the tools that are in place, And then once you do that, you can kind of start small, make your first test a very small group of records, like maybe 5 or 10, so you can look at them and make sure it's doing exactly what you want it to do. And then maybe your next test go a little bit bigger. And then after that, go as big as you feel comfortable going. If you do a test of 10 records and it does exactly what you want it to do, and your records are exactly perfect and they just import right back into your ILS just the way you want it to be, then woohoo, go for it. You're ready at that point. So, just start small with your test. Make sure that you've defined a small group that you can work with. Make sure that what you have defined as the thing you want to fix is doable in MARCEDIT. So in other words, subject headings, that one's a tricky one because subject headings are really dependent upon the scope of the book or DVD or whatever it is. So that becomes a little bit more tricky. However, if you do have a small group like literature, for academic libraries, we didn't always add subject headings for literature. And so it may be that it would be better to have it say American literature or fiction, United States. It might be better for it to say that than nothing for a subject heading. At least fiction, United States would give people a little bit of information about what it was, because we know that PS is American fiction. But, that doesn't mean that everybody else is going to automatically know that. So, being able to just even put like a very basic subject heading based upon the call number, if there is no subject heading, then maybe that's better than having no subject heading at all. But that's one of those things for you to figure out what your priorities are in terms of fixing records, what's your priorities in terms of, if you're getting ready for a migration, what's your priorities in terms of what you need to clean up and prepare those records and things like that. So there's a lot of that sort of thinking that goes on sort of outside the mechanics. So in this case, this is what our task list look like. You may be thinking like, what does a task list look like? So this is one for, adding an audiobook to adding the e-audiobook. So that's actually what we're adding, the e-audiobook to an 099 field. And so you see it's pretty straightforward. You can also reorder tasks. So if you want to put tasks in particular order, you can move them up and down the list. This is a very, add just one field. So pretty straightforward. And then, you have your actions down here. You can delete things, you can add things, all that kind of stuff. So you can play with the task list and see what you want them to do. I know this one's very I was trying to get it to zoom in so you could see a little bit more in terms of what it looks like. This is just one person's list of all their different kinds of task lists they have. So they have task lists where they're cleaning up records in a shared system. They have the Gale Virtual Reference Library Collection. I have that too, and that seems like it always needs clean up. Anytime you're working with ebooks, you're going to have opportunities for cleaning up. If you are merging catalogs, then you may have opportunities to clean up. You may have things you need to edit to prepare records for a shared system. Moving to a shared system, most recently, all of our local fields, any local information we had to go into a different field. So all of our 590s had to go into a different field. And so that was a place where we had to make those changes. And so being able to automate some of that was very, very critical to getting us ready to go in such a short amount of time. So this person has a task list that's way, I have 3. I love that list though, because it just goes on and on and on. So here's another example of replacing information. You see here they're deleting a bunch of things. These are coming from Baker and Taylor books. I've actually followed this sort of thing for some of the Baker and Taylor stuff that I get, although we keep more of the subject heading stuff than they do, but I sort of followed some of the ideas, at least in terms of the Baker and Taylor stuff, because we do get vendor records in that case. And you see that it actually calls out to the task list, because the other part of this particular task list is it's deleting some of these other subject headings. It is adding a local field. So you see we're doing multiple things. We're deleting, we're adding, and then we're calling out to a task list and saying add the genre helpers as well. And then finally, This one really gets such a good example. So we're deleting all these fields. We're adding a local 99 field, 990. We're also calling out to our task list and adding a genre. And then we're finally, to finish it all up and tidy it all up, we're running it through RDA helper and making sure that it meets some of the things that we need for the RDA helper. So this one is really a good example. I just thought it was such a good example of all the different things that you do. So this is something that, you know, the person just went through and built each one of these processes and then essentially linked them all together into a task list that they can run every time they get these books. And so that is a very useful sort of looking at vendor practices and things like that. In terms of the genre cleanup, this is what that task list looks like just for that. So they are doing a lot of cleanup. So, but that's exactly the sort of things that you can automate when you're getting, you know, big processes in. In terms of replacing information, this is, you can just also do replace all, where you're going to say every time you see this in my group of records. Now remember, we're working on a record set. So every time you see this information in my group of records, change it. And then you just run the replace all and bam, it does it. So you can see where it can be really useful when you're talking about things like authority work. You know, of course, authority work, we know we have to be a little bit careful when we're putting our record set together to make sure we really have the right records that need to be replaced for that person's name. You know, we're not going to have William Shakespeare writing in 2010 or something, as you sometimes see when you're looking at records, like, yeah, that can't be that person. But you know, there are opportunities, especially for subject headings, as the subject headings get updated, and also with some of the RDA names, where the names have changed in the authority files. You know, department is no longer DEPT; it now spells out the word department. And so some of those changes that arose out of RDA for authority work can actually be fixed using the MARC edit and using these tools. So it's incredibly useful in terms of what you can do. So what does it look like when you bring it back into a record? You know, you want to bring it back into an ILS, and I couldn't find a lot of examples of this. And since I'm in Alma, I don't really have access to my Voyager to be able to pull you some good examples doing it this way. I'm still learning in Alma how to do this. But if you have your broken MARC, and you can kind of see in the MARC editor what it looks like, it still looks like a MARC record because you don't really see all the XML stuff on the back end of it. You just sort of see all the fields kind of listed. I think Terry's done a good job in terms of presenting that. But then once you export it and you are ready to pull it back in, then what you have to do is you do have to make that decision, and you had to make the decision on this side of what you're going to export it in. And then of course on this side you have to make sure then that your expected character set of imported records. And this is called different things in different ILSs, but that's the part that you're looking for, is you're looking for information that tells you when you do a local import what it's expecting to find. This is just what the Voyager interface looks like, but there are others that do similar things. I could even pull one from a repository to show you guys the next time. So we talked a little bit about the export tab and that you could use it to manipulate MARC. You could even use it in Excel should you want to go that way. But the real uses of MARC are to help reduce the steps that we might have to do. So you know that you have a bunch of records, a bucket of records that need some work. And if you can find commonalities, so using some of those analyzing tools, you may find that just searching in the ILS is the way to go. You may, for me, I can create sets of records within Alma, so I can look for commonalities that way and pull those records together. You may have other tools that you can use. You may have some built-in tools in your system that will allow you to pull together records or to define record sets. That's really what you're trying to get to, is a record set. So if you can somehow find that, a record set, however you can find it. You may do it just through searching. You may have a location or a group of material that you know straight up. You may be given, here's our gift stuff, or here's our records we just digitized, or here's our faculty's, our faculty collection, whatever it may be. So you may have a group of materials. Our art collection done by the art faculty. You may have a collection, a defined collection. So everything in this collection needs whatever. It needs a local note saying this, all of the, the material in this collection hangs on the walls in the library, is not available for checkout, or whatever it may be. Whatever note it is, or it needs the 336, 337, and 338 fields. It needs to be converted to RDA. Whatever it may need, if you can identify those records, that's the first step. Once you identify them, the breaking the MARC part of it, you've seen just sort of through the process of kind of taking a look at MARC, that part of it works pretty well. It's then the next part of it is figuring out what's the best practice to get things done. You may not need to create a task list if it's going to be a one-shot thing. Okay, I'm adding a note for the artwork that hangs on the library to let people know that it's artwork done by the faculty of this university, and there is a map available at the circulation desk. It's once I do these, we don't collect this stuff anymore. It was given to the library a long time ago. I'm just going to add that note so that people will know if they come across this record how they can see this stuff. That's it. And so it's a one-shot deal. I'm not ever going to have to do these kinds of things again, probably. And if I do, I can go in and get my my task, and I can sort of pattern what I've done and sort of take a look at it and reuse it in that way. But I may not want to actually develop a task list and go through that whole process, because it's only one thing I'm going to be doing, and it's only one group of material I'm going to be doing. So you have to think about it a little bit more and do a little bit of planning as you go. So the first thing to do is figure out what your record set's going to be, what you need to fix. And that may come to you the other way. You may know what you need to fix, and then you've got to find your record set. So it may go the other way. Sometimes people say, I found this thing, and then you think, I wonder if there are others. Or you may be involved in a system migration or getting a new ILS or something else, and you're told these local fields that you've been using, these 590s you used, we're not going to use those anymore because we're going to a shared system. You're going to need to put them in this field and code them in this way so that they will not get lost when they match up to the master record. So you may be told something like that, so you know this is what I've got to do. So you may have different ways of getting your records, but that's the first step, define your records. The second step is then to identify what things you need to do that are common across that whole set. Or if not common across that whole set, then are there tools like with the add this field if it does not exist, or if this field exists, then add this field. So you may be able to do some if-thens using the built-in tool. So you kind of got to then analyze the records you have, the problem that you're facing, and then figure out how you can make MARCEDIT work for you. It may not be possible to do it all, but you can kind of see maybe you can do as much as you can. You may also sort of sit down and look at it and go, you know what, there is nothing in common about these, and they're all different, and we're just going to have to do it manually. That may happen. MARCEDIT is certainly not going to fix everything, and there are certainly things that are just going to not going to be easily corrected in MARCEDIT, or it may be quicker just to go, gosh, this is the only one like that. I'm not going to bother with MARCEDIT. I'll just fix this one. So that may be it too. But you can add in those missing RDA fields. You can add those GMDs back if you really need them. But you can take those out. I know there's some OCLC tools and things like that to do that as well, but you can do things. You can do things like convert a 440 to a 491 830. You might need to take a look at those a little bit, because the 490, the 440, that would have, sometimes the code, sometimes the formatting of it will be just a tiny bit different compared to an 830. So you may need to just take just tiny little differences, but you may need to take a little bit of a look at that. So you can't just let it run and do everything and never review what it does. You still need to do the same sort of quality control checks that you would do with any kind of processing you would do. Authority work, it can be very helpful for doing authority headings. Subject headings, sometimes I can see some areas where subject headings could be useful. If you have a small group of materials and you know they don't have any subject heading, and you want to just put something that fits with that classification. You don't want to you don't want to make a mismatch. Genres would be a little bit easier because I think those would be a little easier to be able to do. You can also do some updating obsolete indicators and fields, and you can do things like add local notes, like in my art example. I want to talk just a little bit as we get here at the end about linked data fields. We're not going to talk too much about it, but just to, and this is the older screen, but you did see on the earlier screen that we had the MARC next field too. It's looked the same for a little while, but the RDA helper is now, and I showed you that earlier, the RDA helper is now on the toolbar, so it's up here. So is generate call numbers. That's on the toolbar. So these two are on the toolbar now. So you may see, things may appear a little bit different on the main screen, and you may just have to kind of look around a little bit. But MARC Next is a way that you can play with all of these fun things. I know some of you are probably kind of interested in this, but you can play with BibFrame, and there are BibFrame samples out there too that you can go out and get actual records to play with. So, should you, for those of you who are more systems librarians or know the system librarian who, know somebody who's really a BibFrame, really interested in it, then you may very well want to kind of take a look at it. It also works with some of the other very traditional linked data like the Sparkle and things like that. So there's a lot of fun to be had there if that's your thing. And again, that's under that MARC Next button there too. So just a few data gotchas as I've already talked about these a lot, I think, in other ways, but sort of the four big things that we're looking for when we're looking for data cleanup is, insufficient data. Do we have information that's missing? Do we have confusing or inconsistent data? We have some records that have GMDs, some records that have 336, 337, 338s. Is that confusing? It may not be confusing to the patron, or because they may or may not see it, but it may be confusing to, other library staff. That's the other thing too, is how much impact does that data have? The missing data may be a bigger issue than sort of misleading data, but it's something that you have to weigh. And then of course incorrect data, you just have information that's wrong. And MARCEDIT can really impact and address all of those. And I'm just kind of going to show you some of the resources at the end. You'll have the slides. Carol Ann has the slides. If you didn't get them earlier, you can get them later, but lots of resources here, information about downloading MARCEDIT and the instructions, lots of screenshots. There's also a listserv, links to the plugins. And then also there are a ton of MARC to XML building and conversion tools. So, if you want to explore something beyond MARCEDIT, there's all kinds of things to play with here. I'd love to hear somebody's experience about the XML2 to MARC, the command line tool. I haven't done command line stuff in a little while, so that sounds a little scary but interesting to me. So I'd be very interested to hear what somebody's experience is. And as always, thank you, and I hope you got a lot out of this and are excited to take a look at MARCEDIT. For those of you who've spent some time with MARCEDIT, I hope that you will go in and really explore some of the other tools and resources that are there. And once you get your files, your group of files, and there's also files out there, file sets out there that you can play with should you not want to get them from your catalog. But I think it's more useful if you use your own records because then you'll see real-time things that you can correct or you might want to take a look at. As long as you don't import them back into your catalog, you have not harmed anything by taking records out of your catalog. You're not deleting records or anything like that. You're just exporting and copying the records out. So you can take those records, play with them in MARCEDIT, and then not do anything with them. You don't have to. You can just learn that way. So it's really a learn by doing, and go forward and have fun. And yes, there should be handouts going out. The presentation slides should be going out with the resources.